In this episode, we're going to deal with the critical 4 months in the run-up to the elections on the 27th of April 1994. They were filled with crises, and it seemed on some moments that the whole process was balanced on a knife edge. The role of the Transitional Executive Council came into play. The idea of the TEC was that it would help to oversee the election process and the governance of South Africa during this period to ensure that the elections would be free and fair. What was your relationship with the TEC like? Did you find that they were playing the role that had been envisaged in the negotiations, or were they pushing the envelope?
Well, in a certain sense, both. It was necessary to have this fixed connection point in the transition period of having decided to have an election on the 27th of April 1994 and in the period running up to it. They had to be assured that we weren't misusing our position as still being in government to undermine a genuine process of free and fair elections. On the other hand, they did try to use it to push the envelope, to get a bigger say in government that was envisaged by the institution of the TEC, but we resisted that quite successfully. I continued to govern until the election.
One of the next bombshells that burst was a visit that Judge Goldstone made to you in February 1994, and he came and told you that he'd discovered that the secret South African police base at Vlakplaas was and had been used for illegal purposes, committing crimes, intimidating, murder. Now, this wasn't the first time that allegations had been made about Vlakplaas. In almost at the beginning of your presidency, similar allegations had been made about illegal activities by the security forces, and you had appointed Judge Harms to carry out investigations into all such allegations. But he'd given Vlakplaas a clear bill of health. Why do you think he failed in his inquiry?
I think elements in the police gave him false and wrong information. I think he never got to the truth. So I think he was bamboozled. And it was a failed investigation. He was a good friend of mine. And I'm sorry that he didn't have success. But it was a tragedy that he failed to get to the roots of the problem.
Now, subsequently, you'd frequently spoken to the responsible ministers, the minister responsible for the police, the Minister of Defense, regarding these allegations, and they'd always denied that there was any truth in them. Do you think that they knew about what was going on?
Well, before I answer that question, let me say I also spoke to General van der Merwe, for instance, the Chief of Police. And all of them absolutely denied it. I was told that it was a place where they were called Askaris, where former activists of the ANC were kept, who now acted as informers and who now started to help the effort to fight, in inverted commas, the terroristic acts of the ANC, and that they were playing a very positive role. It's not for me to judge today whether any of the ministers knew about it. If I look at who applied for amnesty in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Act regarding Vlakplaas, The ministers did not. General van der Merwe did not. Although some of them applied for amnesty with regard to other operations and activities. That leads me to think that they were telling me the truth. That they were also bamboozled by the officers in charge at Vlakplaas, and that the activities the terrible activities which took place there and from there was not known to them.
What was your reaction then to these revelations made by Judge Goldstone, which now seem to provide evidence that things had been going seriously wrong? What was your reaction, and how did you deal with the situation?
I was deeply shocked by what Judge Goldstone had to tell me, and struggled with what do we do now? Being a great supporter of transparency and having Judge Goldstone next to me, I decided we must come clean and tell the whole world about this atrocious operation. I therefore arranged, it was on my birthday actually, on the 18th of March, an international press conference in Pretoria. I had Judge Goldstone next to me, and he and I told the story to the press. I also announced that steps would be taken against those involved. Judge Goldstone identified 3 top generals in the police whom he accused of being involved, of knowing about this, and of cooperating with these atrocious projects. I afterwards instructed General van der Merwe to suspend immediately these 3 generals. He didn't like to do it. He was deeply unsettled about this whole thing. He couldn't believe it of his friends. But the evidence was there, and I insisted. And very unwillingly, in the end, after an unnecessary waste of time, General van der Merwe and the top forces in the police did act and did suspend the 3 generals.
Another major problem that occurred just 2 months before the elections was that significant parties were still boycotting the election process. They included the Zulu-based IFP of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, which, according to opinion surveys, had 10% of the support of the electorate. But they also included right-wing Afrikaner nationalist parties grouped together in the Afrikaner Volksfront. And all of these made up an alliance. They also included parties of leaders of national states like President Lucas Mangope of Bophuthatswana. Now, the elections would be problematic if these parties did not participate. How did you try to get them on board?
By talking to them. I tried to convince them in one-on-one discussions more than in group discussions to come aboard and to play their role and not to forfeit their role by boycotting. To me, the most important 2 leaders involved were Mangosuthu Buthelezi of the IFP and General Constant Viljoen. Mangosuthu was the leader of the most populous nation of all the South African nations. Constant Viljoen had the respect of the whole of South Africa as a very successful and a very dedicated general in the defense force. He was a good strong, honest man with integrity. If I could get those two aboard, then I would say we would have parties representing 95% of the total population participating in the election. If it had to go without them, that 95% might have gone down to 80%. I was very worried about the legitimacy of the election. So I really went out of my way. With both of them, it went in directions which I couldn't anticipate when I started talking to them. In the case of Constant Viljoen, it became apparent that he was actually preferring to deal with Nelson Mandela. And although I found it strange, I decided to give him rope on that. Mr. Mandela was very worried about the far right and the military and the possibilities of coups and things like that. So he focused and wanted to focus on Constant Viljoen. In the end, he succeeded to bring Constant Viljoen in by making vague promises, by committing to some changes in the transitional interim constitution, which would say a Volksstaat was not impossible for the Afrikaner nation. And Constant Viljoen, at the very last moment, came aboard, registered his party, submitted the list of candidates, and participated. With Buthelezi and me, it went a different way. Buthelezi, at times I thought I was making a breakthrough. But once he got to his legal advisors, Felgate and Ambrosini, he would retract and he would go back to his former position. So I was beginning in my mind to make peace with the idea that Inkatha wouldn't participate, but that complicated the election. Because what would happen in KwaZulu-Natal, where Buthelezi had his homeland and had his government, not an independent country, but with highly devolved powers, and refusing to cooperate with, for instance, the Electoral Commission. So it was a big problem. And I continued to put pressure on him. The king came to me with him. The king came to me on another occasion without him, bringing his princess, claiming independence. Say he wants his country back. And not only the whole of Natal, but also parts of southern Transvaal and parts of northern Eastern Province. It was an untenable situation.
Now, one of the ways that you addressed this crisis, and I think with the support of the ANC and Nelson Mandela, was to make amendments to the interim constitution during February 1994, strengthening the role of the provinces, strengthening the role of the Zulu monarchy, and then also making provision for this idea of a Volksstaat. What was your thinking about this Volksstaat? Where was it going to be, and how was that going to work?
I was forever in my political career opposing the idea of a Volksstaat. By the time I entered politics, the National Party has stepped away from that idea, although it did say there would be a South Africa with so many other independent homelands for all the black nations. It never said that it would be an Afrikaner Volksstaat. Then the splits came in the National Party. And in the end, we ended up with the Conservative Party as the opposition from the right who said they stand for a Volksstaat, and the National Party saying it's not possible. It's not possible anywhere in South Africa. There's no place in South Africa where the Afrikaners or even the whites were in a majority. And it's nonsense. It's unachievable. So when, through Mandela's negotiations with Goldstone, this idea came to the fore that we should include it in the transitional constitution, I was, in Afrikaans we say, langtand. I was very reluctant to pursue this. But I thought, it can't do any harm. We know it's pie in the sky. But let's insert it if that brings Viljoen and his people in.
Now, despite the changes to the interim constitution, Buthelezi still refused to cooperate, and Lucas Mangope, the president of Bophuthatswana, refused to cooperate. And there was a problem because he was not permitting electioneering in Bophuthatswana. And of course, the pro-ANC elements in Bophuthatswana resisted this and were holding protests. And then to strengthen his position, Mangope called on Constant Viljoen and other elements, the AWB, to come and assist him and prop up his government. And there was this chaotic invasion of Bophuthatswana by the AWB, which turned out to be farcical and tragical. And the situation was on a knife edge. Constant Viljoen had mobilized 3,000 men who could have made a significant difference to the situation. This was a crisis. How did you deal with it?
Just before I reply to that, vis-a-vis KwaZulu-Natal, I did at a certain stage then declare a state of emergency for the province of Natal. Well, this was a very big crisis in Bophuthatswana. We, from our side, mobilized the defense force to be at the ready to intervene, because I foresaw that maybe that would be our last option. We continued to talk to Mangope, but he was very stubborn and was not really interested. It's as if he went into his shell. And Constant Viljoen arrived with his 3,000 men. I don't know to what extent they were issued with weapons or not, but they were at the ready. I think they were at the airport. But then Ter Blanche and his organization jumped the gun. And they went in with their bakkies and their private family cars and their rifles and their revolvers and their shotguns. And they stormed Mabatu. And they started shooting people. And Bophuthatswana's armed forces started to react. There was one video of 2 Afrikaner Weerstands AWB people being shot by Bophuthatswana police or Bophuthatswana defense force members, which went viral. Constant Viljoen wisely, when he saw this, stopped all his activities and withdrew his people. The Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging's effort to destabilize failed, and they ran back home with their tails beneath their legs. We had to deal then with a constitutional problem. Mangope went to his private home in the rural areas, away from Mabatu, the capital of his country. And it was decided in the TEC that a delegation should go and talk to him. Botha was from our side part of the delegation. And this delegation went, and Botha, I think, took the lead and actually told Mangophe that he stripped off his authority. And that was, to a certain extent, the end of resistance from Bophuthatswana. And in the end, the elections could also take place there.
Now, returning to the role of the Zulu king, who came to see you at the Union buildings and asked for the independence of his country. He didn't do this together with Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He seemed to be doing it on his own, supported by the Zulu princes and traditional leaders. What do you think his point was? Subsequently, you had follow-up talks with him in the Durban City Hall, and the City Hall was surrounded by thousands of Zulu warriors. What was going on?
The point he made was, we always offered independence to him. He's accepting the offer now. He wants that independence which we always wanted to give him. But I said it's too late for that. It's impossible. I tried to convince them that by staying in and participating, they will retain their influence. They have a chance of even ruling the province, which they did for one term of office after the elections. We acceded originally that the transitional constitution made provision for the province of Natal. They said KwaZulu must appear there. We said, let's put KwaZulu there. They said there must be special reference to the king. He's not the same as all the other kings and queens, etc. We accommodated that. But we kept talking, notwithstanding all this, but we said no to their request. That ended up with a conference in the Kruger Park, in a hidden away camp, where Mandela was, Buthelezi was, the king was, I was, of course with our teams. And we tried a final negotiation. It wasn't a full success, although I think some understanding has developed there. That which culminated in Parliament being called together a few days before the election to bring about a final amendment to the Constitution regarding the Zulu Kingdom. We went away with many things left undone. And then the Inkatha Freedom Party announced that they will participate. There was a technical problem. Originally, legal advice said they could still, at a late stage, participate on the provincial ballot paper for the provincial legislatures, but that they couldn't for the national one. That legal opinion changed, and it was decided that yes, they could participate in both. And then, within days, they came with a very sophisticated campaign, participated in the elections. There was also some drama about where to put a sticker on the ballot paper, which is a story on its own.
And after the meeting in the Kruger National Park, Buthelezi had said that what was required was international mediation. And Henry Kissinger and Lord Carrington, the former foreign minister of Britain, were called in to provide this mediation, but it was a damp squib. Can you explain what happened then in your interaction with Kissinger and Carrington?
Well, they came to see me late at night at my home, my official home in Pretoria. Very tired and also very confused. They didn't have a clear mandate. This was not handled by the government. It was handled more from the side of Buthelezi. And it was an idea which wasn't thought through very well. So they threw their hands in the air and asked, what must we do? And returned home doing nothing. It was quite farcical, actually, because it was not well thought through, it was not well organized, and there wasn't time for mediation at that stage. We're talking about weeks, or even, I think, maybe a week. No, weeks before the election.
And then suddenly, out of the blue, this gentleman, Professor Washington Okumu, appeared on the scene. And he is credited with persuading Prince Buthelezi to bring the IFP into the elections. And within, I think it was 8 days, the decision was made. But do you think that Buthelezi was actually planning to participate in the elections the whole time?
Let me firstly say, I think Okumu should get more credit. He actually did play a role. Buthelezi was going to fly somewhere and could not see him. And then when Buthelezi was due to fly, there was something wrong with his plane. Okumu was at the airport. Buthelezi had to go back to the airport off the plane. They met and they had this discussion. And then Buthelezi changed openly his attitude. But I suspect that he was going to make a late move. Judging on their material, on the placards which went up almost immediately against walls and against electric poles and so on, very professionally done. He had a campaign in his back pocket, which he launched quite effectively in a very short period, and it made some impact. I have a suspicion that the IFP planned all along to stretch it, to see what they could get, and then at the end to enter the picture.
And this opened the way for the elections on the 27th of April that would be pivotal in South Africa's history, but with the participation of parties that probably represented 95% of the South African electorate. And in our next episode, we will deal with the election and its aftermath.